o'clock. Let's get started. I know people might be joining us sort of ongoing here a little bit. Good afternoon and welcome to the 2024 second installment of Global Conversations Grand Challenges. During the next hour, we will delve into the crucial work being done to ensure access to safe, nutritious, sustainable, and abundant food for our expanding global population. The challenge of feeding the world is immense. As we strive to meet the needs of a population projected to reach 9.7 billion by 2050, as we stand at this intersection of climate change, resource scarcity, and a growing world population, the question of how we can sustainably nourish everyone becomes increasingly complex. Throughout this academic year, we will continue to hear from CALS faculty and staff whose work contributes to solving some of these important issues. Together, we will explore innovative strategies, best practices, and the latest research that can help us not only meet the world's food demands, but also do so in an environmentally responsible and ethically just manner. My name is Jennifer Kushner, and I am the director of CALS Global and your host for today. CALS Global facilitates and supports international engagement for faculty, staff, postdocs, and grad students, as well as cultivates international partnerships and hosts visitors. For today's session, I will introduce each speaker prior to their talk, and if time allows, we will answer some questions from the audience at the end of the hour. Certainly, please feel free to put questions as we go in the chat box as you think of them, and hopefully we'll have some time to get to them at the end. If not, we'll give you the speaker contact information so you can follow up directly with them. We've asked our speakers to touch on the following questions today. First question, from your area or areas of expertise, what innovations hold the most promise for contributing to a world that is safely and sufficiently fed? Number two, where does your field need to grow to address gaps in how it understands and approaches feeding the world? Number three, what is the most important thing you've learned through your work so far as it pertains to feeding the world? And lastly, what advice do you have for someone getting started in your discipline who wants to address food systems and security at a global scale? Without further ado, allow me to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Sedona Chinn. Dr. Sedona Chinn is an assistant professor in the Department of Life Sciences Communication at UW-Madison. Her research focuses on how people navigate uncertain and conflicting claims about science and media, and how social media shifts ideas about who is an expert. Her recent work explores the ways wellness influencers and social media affect food, nutrition, and health attitudes, and how social dynamics surrounding experts and institutions can lead to belief in misinformation. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sedona.
Thank you very much. I am going to share my screen and hope that this is working. It's looking good on my end. Is it looking good to everyone else?
Looking good.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad to be here, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited today to talk about food and nutrition on social media, and in particular, to delve into ideas about wellness and influencers, as well as problems of misinformation that exist in often very unique ways regarding food and nutrition information online. So I'm very excited to be here to talk about that. One of the questions that you asked us to start us off was sort of what innovations hold the most promise for feeding a world safely and sufficiently. And the area that I work in deals with a lot of innovations and developments in communications technologies that increasingly people are seeking information about science from the internet. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone at this stage, but the internet is now the dominant source of health information, or the primary source of health information for people. And one of the things that is interesting about that space is that when you look at all of the science and health information on the internet, so much of it is based around food and nutrition, healthy ways of eating, what are the nutritional benefits or the health benefits of particular foods, etc. And so this is a place where people are increasingly seeking information, but I would say this innovations in these social media technologies hold a lot of promise in facilitating access to information that people may not have access to if they don't have access to talk to a nutritionist about their needs, to talk to a doctor about their needs, but also hold a certain amount of peril. And the same communications technologies that facilitate the spread of that information also allow people to create information that might be incredibly helpful and valuable in sharing their personal experiences and their personal practices around food. But there's a double-edged sword to that, and there can be opportunities to be spreading misinformation as well. So what I want to talk about a lot today is the wellness industry and influencers, and the way in which social media influencers may share helpful information, and the ways in which social media also share potentially misinformation about food and nutrition in particular. Wellness is an incredibly interesting subject to a lot of people. It is incredibly popular right now. It is a $5.6 trillion with a T, trillion dollar global industry, expected to be about $7 trillion in the future. And a lot of that content that is proliferated online regarding wellness is made by influencers. So influencers are ordinary people who build a large following online, and as the moniker suggests, they are often incredibly influential, and they often are sharing their own experiences around wellness and health and food and diets, etc. But they are also they often lack formal training, education, or credentials. And so they may be sharing very valuable information, or they may be sharing potentially dangerous information. But stepping back for a second, a lot of people wonder, it's like, well, why would anyone listen to influencers about what to do with their health? Why would you listen to an influencer about what supplements to take? Why would that be the case? And so I want to take a step back and talk a little bit about what a lot of my research gets into, which is, why are people credible? Why do they search for information where they do? Why do they search for information from particular sources? And how does that persuasion work? Because all of that is foundational to understanding why people might come to hold misperceptions, or why might people elect to engage in harmful behaviors. So influencers, on the one hand, are ordinary people. They're similar to you. They look like you. They live in similar places as you. They're not celebrities. They're not, these sort of high up people. They're ordinary people you can relate to. And we look to people who are similar to us to inform our daily behaviors all of the time. Oftentimes this is very unconscious, but particularly for everyday normative behaviors like eating, we look to the people around us who are similar to us to inform our perception of what is normal and what is acceptable. And so influencers persuade in this way because they're highly visible but relatable to us. And so we are looking to them for what is normal behavior. But on the other hand, influencers position themselves as experts, as someone who is an authority on cooking or healthy eating or fitness or something else. And so in that way, that we're also in some degree deferent to them, because we're listening to their stories, their experiences that they've already been through. Perhaps they have clients who, they show before and after photos. So there are ways in which experts kind of have this double whammy of persuasion. Influencers are both experts and they're your friend. They're relatable and they're aspirational. And this is sort of a two different modes of persuasion that's happening at the same time. And we have a lot of research to show that followers develop similar attitudes and behaviors to the influencers they follow, because these influencers become highly trusted by their followers. For instance, when TikTok has a trend about feta sells out at the grocery store, that these are sort of highly engaging, highly trusted by their followers. So I want to talk a little bit about, despite the fact that we know that the wellness industry is incredibly influential when it comes to marketing ideas about health. Influencers are incredibly influential, and they talk a lot about food and nutrition and what it means to be healthy. There's quite a dearth of research in this area, and partly that's because it's often been sort of dismissed as, oh, those are just silly people doing their entertainment content, and that's not particularly important or interesting or sciencey because it doesn't sound sciencey all the time. Or they're demonized as, oh, those are just cons and shills and they're just trying to get your money. And having this sort of perspective, one, is not nuanced, and two, has resulted in the fields generally being a little bit slow on the uptake about the real influential and persuasive power that these individuals have. So I'm going to get into that a little bit with a couple of studies I've done recently, and then wrap up. So one of the first studies that I've done is looking at trends in the wellness industry, generally speaking. And I've done that by looking at it, doing a computational content analysis of about 500,000 Instagram posts with the hashtag wellness, just to sort of establish a baseline of what are the scientific and health impacts of wellness messages online. One of the first things we noticed was that even though we were just searching for one English language hashtag, we got about 30 or 40 different languages in these Instagram posts, mostly sort of US European languages, but also from other parts of the world as well, showing that wellness is really a global trend and an area of global interest. But on the other hand, there are trends in the wellness industry that others have documented very well about co-opting and displacing sort of traditional health and food practices and divorcing them from their original cultural context. For instance, there's a trend in the US about acai berries and acai bowls being really popular superfoods and healthy foods, and that really divorces they're lauded for their health benefits here, and yet cultivating or harvesting acai berries in the Amazon rainforest is an incredibly dangerous and health-threatening industry. The other thing that we wanted to point out from this was that health generally and healthy eating and natural foods were often presented as a personal decision and a moral virtue. That this was really presented as health was something that you achieve through discipline and good choices. And this really neglects a lot of work and a lot of structural determinants of health. Do you even have access to healthy food? If organic food is put as like the prize of like, this is the best thing you can eat, can you even afford that? And so in this discourse about what does it mean to be healthy in wellness spaces, there's often a neglect of the structural factors determining health and wellness. And a lot of focus on how an individual can become healthy through their own determination, perseverance, moral virtue, and by buying things. It's also incredibly difficult for people to discern what is accurate and inaccurate online, in part because this space in particular goes off the map when it comes to our conceptualizations of what misinformation is. When we talk about misinformation, we're often referring to verifiably false claims that are circulated, often unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, but verifiably false claims. A lot of claims, health claims made in food and wellness spaces online are not verifiably false because they kind of are coming out of left field. They're unevidenced claims. Is that misinformation? Is this anecdote about, well, I drank this juice and that worked for me to cure this condition? Is that misinformation? Or is that just sort of a one-off anecdote? So there are places in which this space is particularly challenging when it comes to misinformation. The other reason why it can be particularly challenging is that most people online and in person, anywhere you're seeking information, don't have the time, resources, or energy to go and fact check every single claim that they're making and they're seeing. What I found, we did a content analysis of popular nutrition influencers. These were Amazon best-selling nutrition authors. And we looked up their Instagrams and we analyzed their posts. And what I realized is that despite holding a PhD in communication and researching and teaching health communication, I did not have the necessary skills to fact check these claims they were making about nutrition. I needed to hire somebody with a degree in dietetics in order to fact check these claims. And what we found was that not only were people often making multiple health claims in the same post, but occasionally when they were making health claims, about a third of the time, there were accurate and inaccurate claims within the same post. So it's not just a matter of differentiating accurate information from inaccurate information. This is incredibly difficult to determine, even for somebody who had advanced degrees and access to our libraries to go fact check. But then the misinformation and accurate information is both in the same post. This is incredibly difficult for people online to try and figure out, especially when you're just scrolling and looking for some simple, efficacious health information. And this intersects with research I've been doing as well, looking at how people evaluate information online. Because there's a tendency to think, oh, well, credible information comes from expert sources with education and credentials. But online, there are a lot of other pieces of information that indicate credibility. For one, things like the number of followers you have indicates how credible, how useful of a resource you are. The aesthetics of that information, especially on visual dominant platforms like Instagram, make an enormous difference when it comes to credibility. But also, as I said before, one of the advantages of having communications technologies that facilitate the spread of nutrition information is that people who do not have access to healthcare, people who do not have access to a nutrition specialist, people who do not have access to a dietitian can find information online. At the same time, many of the audiences of this content, women, younger people, have legitimate reasons to be a bit skeptical of the information that they're getting from doctors. They have been, in some cases, harmed by doctors and medical professionals and want to. And it's a good thing to be empowered to seek out some additional information to double check, to verify. That's the risk-averse position to take in that context. On the other hand, that does mean that these younger, more female audiences may be more vulnerable to misinformation that is spread on these platforms. So in terms of that's some areas of where there has been there needs to be much more research in these spaces, but in terms of big takeaways and some of the most important things I've learned and some of the most important things to bear in mind as you continue to research these topics is that understanding where people's attitudes come from, where they're getting their information, and why they may be opposed to a new technology, a new preservative, gene editing, et cetera, is vital to promoting those technologies and those innovations and those interventions. That if you have a new preservative that is going to keep food fresh longer, that is going to reduce instances of food poisoning, but people think that's kind of gross and weird. Why is my bread staying good for like 3 weeks? That's really odd and bizarre. They're experiencing a disgust response because it's unnatural, which disgust is coincidentally something that's trying to keep you safe from things like pathogens and food poisoning. But a lot of times there's a default response to be like, oh, we'll just give them more information about this new technology. That's what'll fix it. If they have more information, then they'll understand. But that wasn't the reason that they were skeptical of it in the first place. They were skeptical of it because it felt weird and gross. So by giving someone more information, you're not addressing the root of why they felt that way in the first place. You're not addressing the root of that skepticism. You're only talking down to them, being condescending. Now they're mad at you too. Understanding and identifying where do people get their information, where do these ideas come from, why are they responding in the way that they are, is vital for promoting any intervention or any innovation related to anything from genetically modified food to sustainable agriculture to regulatory policies, et cetera. And so really delving into and drawing on the specialty and expertise of people in these communication fields who do this research is vital for any steps forward. So I'll stop there and I'll stop sharing my screen. I'll turn it back over.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hold my questions. So much really interesting stuff to chew on and think about. So thank you. I'm going to move on to our next guest. And like I said, hopefully we'll have some time at the end for some questions. I'd love to introduce our next guest, Dr. Audrey Girard. Dr. Girard is an assistant professor specializing in food chemistry in the Department of Food Science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She earned a BS in Bakery Science and Management from Kansas State University and a PhD in Food Science and Technology from Texas A&M University. Audrey's overarching research goal is to use protein chemistry to improve food quality and sustainability, as well as to promote human health. Audrey, I'm turning it over to you.
All right, great. Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks for the introduction. And I really appreciate following up on Sedona's talk. I have so many questions I want to talk to you about. Really interesting work there. But I'll talk about leading us into how are we trying to feed the world. And so my work, as mentioned, is really in food chemistry. And we're looking at some of our projects focus on plant proteins, as well as some dairy proteins, of course, because we are, after all, in the dairy state in Wisconsin. So improving eating quality of plant proteins using exogenous polyphenols is what I'll be covering today. And I'll talk about kind of what that is. I'm going to be pretty breezy over the chemistry. I think this is a more general audience. So I won't get into all the OChem concepts or anything like that, but more talk about why we're trying to do this and what we can achieve with it. Oh, let's make sure I can advance my own slides here. There we go. All right, so consumers are really looking for proteins in various formats. So not just your traditional meat and dairy, but they want other things. So most households are looking for high protein foods. And even those that are not looking to necessarily increase their protein intake are looking to diversify where they get their proteins from. And this is for a lot of different reasons. Some of it is sustainability, looking at the environment and how the thoughts on animal agriculture and the impact that has on the environment. Some of it's for personal health. As Sedona mentioned, there's lots of influencers out there saying, you know, specific things about eat this and stay healthier. And so some of it comes from things like that. And then there's also just some on personal ethics and whether or not they want to eat animal-based foods. Most people are looking for, or at least half of people are looking for products that are labeled plant-based. So again, looking for a lot of variety there. But this isn't just vegans. So really of the research that was done to come up with these numbers, only 10% of respondents were vegan or vegetarian, but 48% of the respondents said that they specifically looked for plant-based protein. So we know they're looking for diversity. Interestingly, of those that buy plant-based, 93% of them also buy animal proteins. So that is to say they're really diversifying what they're looking for, but they know what the real thing tastes like. They know what an animal protein tastes like, whether it's a glass of milk or a burger or anything like that. So they have really high standards. So what types of products are they looking at? It ranges the gamut from things like plant-based milks, which we're all pretty familiar with. You can go to Starbucks and get your oat milk as your creamer, all the way down to things like plant-based eggs, and so on. But the biggest categories are plant-based milk and dairy and plant-based meats. And so that's where we're really going to focus on what we're trying to achieve here. So specifically, I'm looking at legumes. So these are things like soy, pea, lentil, fava bean, other beans like that, for a couple of reasons. One, they're already currently on the market. So we have a lot of products that have soy and pea protein in them. People are familiar with them and generally pretty accepting. There are some consumer concerns with specific things, but there's lots of variety out there. They're sustainable, so they can fix nitrogen into the soil versus other products like corn or wheat that are just taking nitrogen out of the soil. So they can affix some of it back into the soil, reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So that can be a real positive, especially if you're doing some type of crop rotation. And they also are very healthful. So they are high in protein, 20 to 40%, depending on what kind of pulsar or legume we're looking at. They have a decent amount of fats, depending again what legume we're looking at, but a lot of them are unsaturated fats, which are generally considered healthier, and they have high amounts of fiber, as well as some other polyphenols that can have health benefits. So for all those reasons, legumes make a great protein option, but they don't come without their challenges, right? And two of the biggest ones are flavor and texture. And if you've had any of these products, you're probably familiar with some of this. Flavor is the #1 factor influencing consumer purchasing. So when we think about legumes, we often think about odors. So we smell things as we're biting into that burger. So it might be a beany, earthy flavor or odor that we're getting. And then we taste things. So it might be a metallic sensation, and astringent or kind of a mouth drying feeling. So all of those can go against legumes. Another thing is texture, right? We want, if we're looking at a meat mimetic, we want it to feel like meat, right? When we bite into that burger, we want that chewy texture that we're looking for and that juiciness that we're looking for. So the Good Foods Institute put together this data on top barriers to consumption. And of course, you see number one is taste. So why consumers haven't tried plant-based meats or why they didn't continue to buy them. And this kind of correlates with what we've seen in headlines recently about some of these bigger meat mimetic companies having a lot of issues, like the Impossible and the Beyond Burgers, having a lot of issues getting people to buy their products. So some people are super invested in it, really want the health benefits or the environmental benefits that come from them. Some people who also like beef burgers taste them and just don't like them, so they don't come back to them. Other things that kind of tie into texture, the quality didn't meet expectations, and then just spelled out explicitly texture. So we know these things are really important. And this is where we talk about one potential solution that we have for that. And that is using polyphenols. So polyphenols are plant secondary metabolites. So they're ubiquitous in plants, especially you'd see them in lots of fruits and vegetables. So these help to defend the plant. So some of it can be from if a plant stem gets broken, it can kind of heal a wound and help prevent infections, can prevent bug predation. So it's not eaten by different bugs, things like that. But these also have really strong antioxidant properties. So you might have heard of them in reference to their health benefits, and they're known to interact with proteins, which can be beneficial when we start thinking about both flavor and texture, which we'll get to in a second. And there's a wide variety of structures and sources of these polyphenols. So this is just an example of one structure of a flavanol. Again, I'm not going to get too deep into the science, just showing that there's a wide variety of where they come from and the different types. This suggests that we can kind of tailor what we're doing based on the different structures of these polyphenols. They're going to interact with proteins differently. They're going to interact with enzymes that cause lipid oxidation differently. They're going to have different antioxidant capacities that can all affect their veracity in these different products. So again, just different examples of polyphenols. I'll interchangeably today use polyphenols, tannins, and proanthocyanidins, but generally all falling under this polyphenol umbrella. So I'll try to keep it to that. So again, these legume protein off flavors, when we think of them, they often come from two main sources. We think about lipid oxidation or fat oxidation and Maillard reactions. So lipids that are remaining with the protein ingredient after processing tend to oxidize. So they tend to go rancid. You'll kind of get these funky smells that we're seeing over here. So generally, when we think about like the Impossible Burger, the way that's going to be processed is we're going to extract those proteins from the bean, and then we're going to use those dried proteins in further processing. But there's still some amount of lipids that remains with it. We don't remove all that. So that's the part that can oxidize. Maillard reactions. So these, think about like baking a loaf of bread, right? You're getting that nice brown color, that nice smell that comes with it. There's often a lot of good things that come with Maillard reactions. However, in conjunctions with lipid oxidation, we can get off flavors. And so on the right hand of your screen, you see some of the examples of that. We won't go into detail, but those are some of the limiting factors for the off flavors. There are current methods to try to reduce some of these. Solvent extraction is one. So this works by trying to extract or separate the lipids out, but we also denature the proteins. So we change their structure and their function. We have a lot of solvent waste. So as we're looking at more sustainable practices, that can be an issue. And it can also have consumer concerns. So you may have heard about hexane in soy. Hexane is one of the solvents that's used to extract lipids. And the consumer concern is that some of it may remain with the soy or may have come in contact with the soy, of course, and there's health concerns with that. Nothing that I know of that has any evidence behind it, but nonetheless, it can be a concern for some consumers. Another intervention is salting out. So it's changing the salts to help to precipitate out the proteins. And in that way, we can extract the lipids so they would stay in solution with whatever we're doing, and we salt out the proteins. This, however, can lead to protein loss, so we're not recovering all the proteins, and we still have some amount of lipids. There's another option called beta-cyclodextrin capture. So this is a carbohydrate that is cylindrical. And essentially, you can form inclusions with these different off-flavor compounds within the center of the cyclodextrin. But it hasn't been widely picked up because it's unfamiliar to consumers. If you saw beta-cyclodextrin on an ingredient label, you might not know what it is. You might be a little concerned about that. Just fun fact here, it's also in Febreze. So it's one of the things that helps Febreze reduce the odors in the air. And that's how it works. Okay. But our hypothesis, focusing on the off flavor, was that we can reduce it by decreasing lipid oxidation. Using these polyphenols, we can decrease lipid oxidation, decrease Maillard reaction, and reduce carbonyl volatiles. We're going to focus just on reducing lipid oxidation. And so the way that we thought this could occur is that the polyphenols can interact directly with the lipoxygenase enzyme. So this is an enzyme that catalyzes this lipid oxidation. It's a protein because it's an enzyme, and we know that polyphenols and proteins can interact, or by scavenging radicals and thereby preventing further oxidation. So one of my grad students did her master's project on this. And so first she looked at polyphenols just specifically interacting with legume proteins. I won't go into all the details of the difference between these polyphenols, but know that these are 4 different polyphenol treatments. And we looked at how much they're actually binding, or how much of the polyphenol is bound in solution when we have them in solution with pea and soy protein isolates. So soy had a very similar response to this. And we see that half or more of the polyphenols are bound, especially when we start looking at those larger polyphenol structures. So this is indicating that it's likely going to have some type of impact on those enzymes. And this happened both with heat and without. So the reason we looked at this is because as we think about food processing, almost any process is going to include heat, right? Whenever we're cooking food, we're almost always heating it. And we're showing that even with that heat, we still bound the polyphenols. That also then led to a reduction in lipoxygenase activity. So we looked directly at polyphenols interacting with this enzyme, again, that catalyzes the lipid oxidation. And we see a reduction in the lipoxygenase activity that's based on the amount of polyphenols that we add. So as we add more polyphenols, we reduce that lipid oxidation even further. So from there, we put this in the protein solutions. We looked at how many lipid oxidation products we were getting. We did see a reduction in peroxide and T-bars values, which is a measure of primary and secondary lipid oxidation. Heating really had minor effects. So the processing we think isn't going to have a huge effect, but generally it further reduced lipid oxidation products. And then something that you guys can kind of think about here is the actual off odors. So what we can smell from these products. So we measured it with gas chromatography, and we were looking at hexanal and heptanone. So hexanal has a grassy or green pea odor, where heptanone has a banana-like or a fruity odor. And we see that with our different polyphenol treatments, we are greatly reducing the amount of those odors, the amount of those compounds that are in our protein solutions. To put it in perspective, this line, this dashed line, shows the limit of detection. So how much as a human can we actually smell? And we see that with some of these polyphenols, we're reducing it below the limit of detection. So we wouldn't be able to smell the hexanal, for example, with green tea extract here when it's been heated. And almost none of the heptanone is apparent after we've added these different polyphenols. So we're continuing to work on that, continuing to explore what mechanism is behind it. But the idea here is that polyphenols would be one way to help improve the flavor, probably in conjunction with some of those other methods as well. But it could be just another layer to help reduce the lipid oxidation, reduce some of those off flavors. We're also looking at Maillard reaction. I have another student working on that now. And we're seeing similar results where it does reduce some of the Maillard reaction. All right, so from there, that's talking about the flavor. Let's move on and talk about texture just a little bit. So I talked a little bit about processing, right? We start with different legumes. We extract the protein, so then we get out a dry powder. And then we try to take that and turn it into some type of meat-like product, or we can take the pea or soy directly and try to extract the soluble proteins and make some type of milk-like beverage. But of course, we're going from a very dry product to something that's pretty moist, right? And has totally different structure. So this is a big change. One way to show the difference in the protein functionalities, here we're looking at whey, so a dairy protein concentrate, forms a really nice gel. This is a nice firm gel where we have a lot of disulfide interactions, so protein-protein interactions that are holding things together pretty well. Soy protein isolate is fairly good at mimicking this. You can see there's some discoloration there, but in general, it forms a fairly firm gel with similar properties. But as we start looking at other legumes, we see we don't have those disulfide bonds, so not as much of that protein-protein covalent interaction. And for some things like pea protein isolate, we form these really soft gels, more aggregates really than gels. So how are we going to ameliorate that? Again, one way is with the polyphenols. So this is some work, not on legume proteins, but on one form of gluten proteins. One of the gluten proteins called gliadins. So we added these gliadins to starch and cooked them to look at the viscosity over time. And we see, so this gray trace shows our temperature, so how we're cooking it. So we started about 50 degrees Celsius, we ramp up to 90 and then back down to 50. And we see the typical starch profile here in the solid black, where we're increasing viscosity as the starch gelatinizes. So think about cooking a gravy, right? As you cook it, it starts to get a lot thicker. If you continue shearing it, which is what's happening in this machine, the viscosity, it thins out a little bit, and then it sets into a gel as you cool it back down. When we add those polyphenols, so the proanthocyanidins, we see an interesting increase in viscosity early on, and this is actually when the proteins are denaturing. So they're kind of opening up and allowing the polyphenols to interact with them there. And then it reaches a higher peak viscosity. So this is saying that there's some type of polyphenol protein starch interaction going on, which could be really useful as we think about making beverages, yogurts, plant-based proteins like the Impossible Burger and things like that. This is looking at the fluorescence data, just showing that as we increase the amount of polyphenol, we are increasing or decreasing the fluorescence of the tryptophan. So that's saying that we are binding them. So we know there's some polyphenol protein interaction going on. That as we increase the temperature, that's also shifting some of those interactions as well. So one more thing from this data before we get into the legume proteins themselves. Polyphenols can strengthen protein film. So here we have a control film. It's very flimsy. Think about like saran wrap where it's very malleable. So this is a control gluten film versus when we added these polyphenols, it became much stiffer. So it was more like cellophane, like you'd wrap a gift basket in. So much stiffer. And we can see a structural difference when we put it under great magnification. So this is using SEM. So we're looking under a microscope and seeing that there are big cracks within the control structure. This would be very permeable. So if we were trying to use it as a packaging material, we would see a lot of moisture coming in and out of it, a lot of gases, things like that. And then with our polyphenols, we're seeing that it has a much more cohesive structure, not as many cracks, and it also has much greater resistance to extension. So it's much tougher, which we could tell immediately just handling them. So we wanted to test this with these different legume proteins and see how it would affect them when we're trying to make something like a protein that would go into a burger. So we saw, first of all, just looking here that as we heated the native pea proteins, we saw an increase with the amount of interaction between those polyphenols and the proteins. So this again was expected because we're denaturing those proteins, we're opening them up, and the polyphenols are then able to interact. And we saw evidence of two different types of bonding, so covalent and non-covalent. Covalent being the more solid bonds. It's going to change the structure to a greater extent. So we see that it changes the gel electrophoresis, it changes where they are in the ladder and things like that. So different types of interaction are going on, very strong interactions, and we're thinking that during processing, that is going to affect the puff. I have photos that will show that it does in fact affect that, but let me talk through it a little bit just so you know how some of these plant proteins are made. So here we're looking at an extruder. This is a machine that is used to texturize vegetable proteins. So the idea is you're putting your protein in, it's getting fed through a twin screw or a screw conveyor under heat and pressure. It's going to unfold, it's going to realign, and then it's going to come out of a die at the end. So a die or a nozzle at the end that's going to force it out. If we force it out under heat and pressure, we're going to get some type of puff. So think like a Cheeto, right? You go in with something that looks more like spaghetti, and as it comes out, because it's under heat and pressure, it expands quite a lot. And so you get this kind of puff. This is used if we're thinking about a texturized vegetable protein. So we're thinking about like a patty. We're going to grind this up along with some other ingredients and reform a patty, right? Because we're trying to take some type of plant protein that's very globular and turn it into some type of animal protein that's very fibrous. Another way that you can do it is still under pressure, but the temperature comes down a lot, so there's not as much of a temperature ramp. And then you don't get as much aeric cell expansion, and you get something that's more like a jerky. So you might do this to get a chicken strip or something similar to a chicken strip. So that's how it's typically processed. But not all proteins texturize or expand equally, and it's still limited as we compare it to muscle texture. So for example, here we have soy protein that's been texturized using an extruder versus pea, lentil, and fava, so different types of legumes. And you see the soy expands pretty nicely, whereas these other ones are very dense. If you went to bite into them, it would be very hard, hard to break apart. So here, the idea is that as we add these polyphenols, they are going to interact with the proteins in different ways, like we showed on a couple slides ago. It's going to realign the structure and make a denser structure, hopefully for a better texture. And we, in fact, did find that as we added polyphenols, we got more expansion, which you can see visually. And then there's just some numbers on the expansion ratio, so how big it puffed up as it came out. So there is some type of effect based on how much polyphenol we're adding, and we're exploring that further. All right, so let me conclude the research part, and then I'll get into the questions that we were given to answer. So polyphenols can decrease the lipid oxidation, which gives it a potential to reduce off flavors. The main mechanism is interacting with proteins, potentially with that specific enzyme lipoxygenase. Again, based on what type of polyphenol we're using, we can affect how much reduction we get. So the higher molecular weight, the larger polyphenols were more effective. This is trying to look at the economics of it. So we showed that mixed extracts were about as effective as isolated compounds. So that was saying that we can just extract all the polyphenols from a type of fruit like grape versus trying to extract all the polyphenols and then pick out one specific polyphenol from that and further refine it. And this was effective after heat treatments. Again, really important as we're thinking about processing different food products. We also saw that they alter protein functionality. The effects can vary by protein. We have a lot more data on that, but I didn't want to get into it here today. All right. So of course, this work is not done by me alone. In fact, most of this work is not done by me in the lab at all. But I direct a great team of scientists in my lab. So Vanessa got her master's with me. Lily is working on her master's PhD. And Rachel Hutchison is a postdoc in the lab. And they've been really influential in this research. Collaborators that I have both here and at Texas A&M. And then, of course, thank you for the funding sources. And so that shows the different scientists in my lab, and that's the extruder and some of our puffed product coming out of it. All right, so now let me take a few minutes to address the questions. So the first one was, from my area of expertise, what innovations hold the most promise? And I would say one thing is that sustainable practices that are effective and practical are so necessary. So I can sit here and research sustainable practices all I want, and I can try to make the best non-meat product in the world, but if somebody's not going to eat it, it doesn't matter, right? It needs to be practical. So it needs to taste good. It needs to be something that fits within people's cultural beliefs. So we need to take that into consideration. We're not just going to get everyone to change to whatever the most sustainable diet is all at once, right? We need to affect that in different ways. It also needs to be practices that are make economical sense. Companies aren't just going to go to sustainable practices if it's more expensive and they're not making money on it. So we need to think about that kind of whole picture. So I don't have one specific innovation. I'm just thinking about looking at sustainable proteins. That's something that I think is really important. Where does the field need to grow to address gaps in how it approaches feeding the world? And I think one of the things is integrating the whole picture of how food is produced and processed with how people choose and purchase and consume their foods. So this is already something that's in progress. People are thinking about this. But we really need to think about everything from growing the food to harvesting it, to getting it into people's carts at home. And then once they get it home, they need to eat it, right? 40% of food waste comes from just people not eating the food at home. So we need to think about the occasions when they're purchasing food. Who wants to give up a really celebratory meal with the meat centerpiece, right? A lot of people don't. So that might not be a great target for where we're thinking about plant-based meats, but every day eating occasions might be less special to people, right? It's just grabbing your lunch out of the fridge at work. Maybe that's less important to you. And so you might be more open to trying different foods at that point. So thinking about where we want to work on that. And then working kind of across disciplines here is another area of interest, right? Thinking about how the food is produced. I work with a lot of plant breeders, and so they're trying to think of things that are going to be more resilient to climate change. And then I'm looking at, okay, but how does that affect the functionality of these proteins? So thinking across the whole spectrum. Most important thing I've learned so far in my work, as it pertains to really anything, is that everyone you'll ever meet knows something you don't. That's a quote from Bill Nye. I really appreciate that because, sometimes we think we just know everything, but everybody knows something we don't. They have a different perspective, right? They have a different background. And if you just listen to people, it's really interesting the things you can learn from them. And then advice for someone getting into the field or discipline. First, make sure you're deeply passionate about whatever subject it is you're trying to learn about. So, food science in general is huge. So think about what you really care about and learn deeply about that. Be an expert in that area. And then develop communication skills, including listening to others. So not just telling your story, but like we just heard from Sedona, right? Just telling people more and more information is not going to change their minds. You really need to know where they're coming from. So that's important as well. And then be willing to grow and change your mind as you learn new information. Always important, I think, especially from a scientist standpoint, right? We're not always right. We have to update our information based on what we know. So with that, I want to thank you all for your attention. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And if there's time, I'm happy to entertain questions.
Thank you so much. Well, both of you. So interesting. And I think about, one of the sort of frames that we often use here in CALS Global to talk about our work is food systems transformation, and how do we come at that from all these very, very complementary and diverse perspectives. So let's see here. I'm going to pull up the screen again with your contact information. One sec. All right, so we do have a few minutes, and so we do have time for a few questions. If you do have a question, you can certainly feel free to unmute your microphone, or maybe I can just see if there's any hand. Let me just take a look here. You can also put your little hand icon thing up, and or if you feel more comfortable putting something in chat, that's fine too. So just give it a moment here and see if we've got any questions.
Sedona, I really enjoyed your presentation. I have a question for you if no one else wants to start. You mentioned that just giving people more information, right, is not the way to go about it. As we think about new technologies, me as a food scientist, I think about these new ingredients, things like that. How would you recommend going about it? So you said, you know, you need to hear it from their perspective. How do you recommend going about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, but also an amazing sort of place to start. That there is a tendency, and I think part of this is because I often see this among scientists, that because we're scientists, we like learning more about things. And so we like to get more information about things, and therefore we like it more when we get more information. But there's a sort of expectation that this is what we call the deficit model of science communication, which has like 30 or 40 years of research debunking it, that this sort of one way, like the public doesn't know about science, they don't know about science, and that's why they're skeptical. And so if we just give them information, they'll like science more and become less skeptical and be more accepting of scientists' positions. This isn't taking into account necessarily that people have more information than they ever have in the past, and that trust in science is generally high. So when we're seeing pushback and skepticism, it's usually around certain things for certain reasons. And so there is a lot of, it is important to tailor your messages to the audience that you are trying to reach. And that does mean doing a bit of legwork to figuring out, you know, why are we seeing resistance to, is the resistance to plant-based meat the same as the resistance to cultured meat? Are those coming from sort of a different set of things? Or are some people resistant to cultured meat for some reasons and other people are resistant for other reasons? And thinking carefully about your audience and listening to the concerns of your audience and tailoring messages towards different audiences is really a much a stronger way forward. Often we talk about framing messages about our new technologies, about these developments in a way that is in line with the community's values and interests.
Great, thanks.
All right, other questions for our speakers? And I'm looking at the chat and I'm looking at the participants. And we do have contact information here. So if you're not comfortable asking now, you can certainly feel free to follow up later. Sedona, I'm going to ask a question since I'm not seeing anything else right now. Is the last question that we had for you, and maybe I missed it. What advice do you have for someone getting started in your field or your discipline who's interested in addressing food systems or food security on a global scale? Did I miss that? And could you repeat it if I did?
I'm happy to talk more about it. I think fundamentally these are interdisciplinary questions. There is no one discipline or one expertise that is going to solve any of these problems. And to draw on the expertise of other people and to seek out ways that you can develop interdisciplinary expertise, whether that, you know, the example of plant breeding, as well as sort of the chemistry of what does that have, how does that have implications for the proteins, or whether that is sort of, okay, we're thinking about why do people not like certain types of plant-based proteins, and then we're also going to look at how they're marketed and what is the sort of conversation socially around those and how do people feel about things being processed versus natural, et cetera. And so seeking out ways to develop interdisciplinary expertise, I think, would be my recommendation.
Thank you. All right. I am not seeing any other questions. Before we part ways, I want to thank everybody for participating today, our speakers, our participants, and to let you know that our next and last global conversations for this semester will be on April 18th at 1 o'clock. You can register with a QR code here. Oops, sorry. And it's on our website as well. All right. Thank you. It's been good listening to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the chance to speak. Bye.
Take care.